Hi, my name is Britt Ransom. I am an artist, primarily working in digital fabrication and sculpture and installation. I live in Pittsburgh and I am a professor at Carnegie Mellon. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about my practice and about the process of long listening, which is something that I find integral to my work and the way that I operate in my kind of studio day-to-day practice. And I want to share a little bit about how my studio practice and processes come together. I see my practice as a process of long listening. Listening is to give one's attention, to take notice, sometimes to act, to make an effort to be still but ready. To be a good listener is to be open, to be a receptacle, to potentially be changed by someone or something, to take stock but not necessarily speak, to let things move around you, perhaps stir something in you. My work is a series of careful observations of the environments that we inhabit and that we build and that we share. We're the biggest pests on this planet, and I think about that all of the time in my work. The persistent sound of termites eating things that we make, the buzz of cicadas at summer's beginning and their silence at the seasonal end, the sound of that ice in my hands melting, a swarm of birds, the cadence of their soft floating, their wings moving and snapping against the air. These are the things that I think about in my work. Landscapes that are alive, shifting, changing, dying, regenerating around me, in me, with or without me. I think about Sagan's pale blue dot, me, an ant, you, a roach, collectively sort of gross, constantly at odds, forever hypocritical in the way that we approach true cohabitation and understanding. My practice has always been a reinterpretation of the materials and systems that surround us, that we are a part of, that we see but we don't always hear.
GEEX, the Glass Education Exchange, welcomes Britt Ransom as the final speaker of the 4th season of the GEEX Talks lecture series. Systems, sight, materials, history, biology, and observation are some of the key components of Britt's work. Britt describes her practice as posing questions, but rarely giving answers, to think about our collective selves a little differently, and how we situate ourselves within an environment. Britt Ransom is the recipient of the Hopper Prize, Formlab's User Impact Award, Joan Mitchell Center Residency, and many more. Her writing has been published in the Leonardo Journal, published by MIT Press, the 3D Additivist Cookbook, and In and Out of View, Art in the Dynamics of Circulation, Suppression, and Censorship. She received her BFA from The Ohio State University in Art and Technology, and her MFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago in Electronic Visualization/New Media. If you're watching during the premiere, feel free to join me in the live chat for resources and discussion. For all of our audience, comment, share, and get comfortable. Before we begin, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Wet Dog Glass.
I'm an avid sunset chaser. It's a really important part of my process and my practice and my work. I go almost every day. I share this time with very few. It's my favorite time to listen. When the day slowly shifts, the time has passed, the time it's going, it's changing, and it's gone. That last gasp of light that we see before the Earth's rotated around one more time, some of us fall off, some of us stay on, and all the time we keep kind of spinning. When things sleep and other things wake, that shift change. That's where the important part of my practice takes note of the environment. It's my favorite time to both connect and disconnect from nearly everything else, where I feel the most content, where I listen the most intently, and where I become the closest with someone or something else. My collaborations and interventions, and often uninvited engagements with the environment and our non-human neighbors, is about the micro, the macro, the zooming in and out of human-built environments to an anthill. Or it could be the other way around. I decided to break this talk into a few sections. The work's not really being presented chronologically or in any sort of linear way, with exception to finishing with what I'm working on currently kind of at the end. So I want to start with a project called Parallel Paths that is one of a more recent series of work that I've been thinking about in my practice, and a project that I feel like doesn't necessarily have an end point, but is one that I've been working on for a number of years now. A lot of times I'll break my work into different groups, all under the kind of category of one process. And so I'll talk about this kind of piece as fossils first. So much of my work is thinking about human beings being the most expansive pest on the planet, as I mentioned. Most of my work finds its starting point on walks, or like I said, at sunset. And so this is a piece that was inspired by a hike that I was taking when I lived in LA. And I was hiking in this area called Kings Canyon, which is a little bit outside of Los Angeles. And I became really struck by these paths that were being kind of eaten into different trees that were inside of Kings Canyon. And these paths looked remarkably like the LA highway system, or like little kind of micro highways, or like micro worlds. And I realized that these were actually from a pest called bark beetles. They're a pest that's all over the United States, in many parts of the world. And they're a type of pest that they eat the wood underneath the bark and leave these kind of intricate trails and paths. They'll hatch inside and underneath the bark and kind of eat their way around a tree. This was around 2018. So at that time, we were experiencing in LA one of the worst wildfire seasons that we had had on history. I started using my cell phone as a 3D scanner. I think about it as a recording device more than a communication device. And I started scanning these pieces of bark because I didn't want to, and nor should I, kind of remove them from their location and spread the pest, but was really interested in this kind of analogy between the paths the beetles were making and thinking about myself as this kind of pest or insect that travels these same types of paths, thinking about things like highway systems, our neighborhoods, the way that I felt like I was acting and behaving like a pest in a larger system. For example, when driving my car every day for hours in Los Angeles. I started taking 3D scans of these to start thinking about them as these kind of microcosm worlds where this type of pest becomes an analogous kind of relationship to myself, or a metaphorical relationship to myself, and the type of systematic kind of pest network that I think we all exist in. So these are 3D prints that are made on a resin printer. And I think about these as kind of acting as a fossil for a piece of nature that's, one, both actively changing and disappearing in front of me, but also as a way that I can kind of mark out what one path from one kind of pest system looks like versus another. I think about these as mathematical representations. They're a collection on the computer of a series of vertices and edges and faces that make up a shape. And it starts to kind of blur the boundaries between the physical world that we exist in and the computational world, and our ways of kind of bringing those two spaces together. Playing with blacklight is something that's really interesting to me in my work. I'm often using it as a mechanism for thinking about the things that we see or can't see. I think about it as a tool that's used in forensics, but I also think about it as a tool that's used in fabricating processes. Especially for me, it's the tool that I use to cure a lot of my resin-based 3D prints. And so I like to think about this, though, as like an illumination tool for allowing me to see into a world that I otherwise maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize just my own kind of human optics. I'm really interested in leaving kind of marks from the tools that I use in my process and practice as part of the installations. I think one thing that's important to mention is that I worked for a long time at a science center, and you'll see a lot of those kind of like display mechanisms that we see in kind of science and historical reframing of artifacts or different specimens. You'll see that a lot in my work. I'm really interested in kind of leaving those or like utilizing those types of mechanisms of display because it's something we innately kind of recognize. But at the same time, I'm interested in leaving the hand of the machine in here as well. So I'll leave things like the support structures from the 3D printers. I'll play with things like the blacklight as a material in the work to kind of reference back to the process in which these things are made. Just to give kind of an installation view of what these things look like. I'm often working in and out of both like individual sculptures, but also thinking through kind of larger installation-based spaces. A lot of times when I'm making work, I also, like I mentioned, think about this in kind of a series. So for me, these are like a ghostly representation of something that's not going to exist for much longer, or maybe doesn't even exist right now. Like these pieces of this tree are now dead and kind of gone. And I think about ways that the computer is able to kind of capture and hold on to elements of our environment that we ourselves are kind of either aiding and destroying or, shifting the environment so pests come in and kind of destroy those things alongside of us. So I think about the 3D printer as this machine oftentimes to encapsulate or fossilize parts of the environment. But what's interesting to me is the kind of data loss that's happening between our physical environment and also the data loss that happens when I scan something in the real world, bring it into the computer, and then put it back out into the real world, into real space again. The way this project really started, though, and I'm working backwards a little bit, was through a series of drawings and maps. So the part of Parallel Paths that was really interesting to me were these kind of drawings that the beetles themselves were making underneath and on top of the surface of the wood. These are a series of small, they're about 8 by 8 inch powder coated steel discs that are representations that are direct kind of lifts or representations of the bark beetles paths that they're making under the wood. You can see where they've started to hatch and then kind of emerge out in paths. And to me, these started to look like neighborhoods that were maybe not following a rectilinear kind of grid plan, but I think of looking at something from an aerial view when we're flying in an airplane or we're from a high point and we're able to see how humans build. These started to look like kind of neighborhoods or cul-de-sacs or different parts of maps to me. Just to give some context for scale, they're in the far right-hand side. But the way this really started was by doing an installation that was in Long Beach that was actually made for pedestrians. This is an outline of most of the main parts of different LA highway systems and how they converge. This version of this installation was meant to be a space where we could look at flow, obstruction, kind of planned versus haphazard pathways. The bark beetles paths are used as this metaphorical reference to my own. And the way I did this was by layering the bark beetles paths from my 3D scanner into the map of the LA highway system. And depending on where you're looking through the glass of this installation, you're able to kind of, using anaglyph kind of technology that's old that we all know and recognize, would block out certain parts of the human-based map and only expose parts of the bark beetles map, and vice versa, depending on which way you went. And you're seeing that kind of bark beetle path laid on top of it, and embedded in that is the LA highway system. And just a view of what it looks like from a pedestrian kind of passing on the street and being able to look into this space. I'm also really interested in scale as an artist that's working in sculpture. I kind of shift in between these kind of micro worlds in also thinking about how we explore things in kind of a macro sense, or at least a human scale sense. When we're talking about things that are really teeny tiny. So another part of my process is really thinking about how to take micro-sized worlds and make them legible on a human-sized scale. So I often will use my cell phone to 3D scan pieces of, for example, in this case, bark beetle infested wood when I'm out and like kind of experiencing the environment or finding something for the first time. And so like what you're looking at is a series of These are made with a CNC machine. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's a machine that it's a subtractive machine, meaning we start with a block of material, put in a computer file, and then the machine kind of carves away at the material until it reveals or it makes the 3D file that we have on screen. So this is an enlargement of a piece of bark beetle infested wood that was maybe only about 6 inches. And I'm trying to blow that up to a scale that feels more body-like or human body kind of scale. I'm really interested in kind of talking about like what my studio looks like. I often joke and say that like my studio is a computer. My studio is portable. I'm talking with you today from my actual studio, but at the same time, I would say a really large part of my studio process begins in situations that look almost like this. Obviously a desktop computer, but for this particular project, I was working with the LA Arboretum and scientists there who were generously kind of letting me bring bark beetle specimens that they had on site into a special room to 3D scan these and then give them back. What's really nice about working this way and like recreating their paths in a complex computer model is that I'm also able to give that back to those same scientists that are helping me kind of collect these scans. So I'm really interested in that kind of like reflexive and collaborative way of working. But sometimes my studio looks like this, and sometimes the post-processing and the actual making part happens in a place that looks like where I'm talking to you from right now. I just want to give you some kind of other images of what my process looks like. A lot of times I'm making things in almost small parts and puzzling them back together in the computer. What you're looking at is a bark beetle, a piece of bark beetle specimen that has bark beetles in it. It's a live specimen. And it's being scanned with a laser scanner. I have to do that in sections and then recreate the entire object in the computer to then fabricate it back out as a whole object. And so again, I just like to show some examples of like what a studio process can look like. This is back in a lab. I often am working alongside of my students in labs at school. And so just to give you an idea of like what this process looks like in terms of capturing something, I make a lot of small scale models before I will kind of scale things up in a large sense. I'm really a person that's interested in kind of sharing process. This particular scan that I made, this is the one that's to scale on my phone. So this is one that I scanned on my phone. But a lot of times I'm thinking about like the actual sculptural representation of that. This allows me to think through, again, like the mechanism of display and the mechanism of how we look at artifacts or scientific objects, and trying to find a way to like bridge those two languages of thinking through visual contemporary art and sculpture and installation, but also thinking about this from a perspective of scientific display and also scientific information. I think about being a citizen scientist in a lot of different ways as a part of my practice. And just one more image for scale, not the clearest, but just to give you an idea of scale, this is about 6 inches. Those are my feet on the ground. And this is like what replicating something at that scale looks like. At the time I was making this, these are all made out of a recycled high density foam. And so I try and work with things like PLA, which is a technically biodegradable plastic, though slow to biodegrade. And I also work with recycled materials as often as I can. I'm very like aware of material and certainly thinking about the fact that I make work about the environment oftentimes with materials that are problematic. I want to keep talking a little bit about insects. This one is still a really active and fresh series called Brood 10. We're getting ready here in the United States to experience the hatching of a new brood of cicadas in the year 2024. We're about to have a 17-year and a 13-year cycle of cicadas hatch at the same time. If you're not familiar with this insect, this is a prevalent insect in different parts of the United States, but this is primarily a spring through summer kind of insect called the cicada. It emerges from underground after it feeds off the roots of trees, the water that comes off the roots of trees. They are periodical. So sometimes we have some that hatch every 2 years, which is how we have them every summer. We have some that hatch in 13-year cycles and 17-year cycles. And in the year, I believe it was 2020 and 2021, we had Brood 10 hatch during the time that we were going through a really kind of complex and transformative part of the pandemic. So the cicada cross-culturally is seen as this symbol of often of like rebirth, resurgence. And so during this time when we were, thinking that we were kind of about to be freed from all of the like at home kind of moments that the pandemic, these cicadas were hatching from underground after 17 years of sleep. So I was thinking about what that meant in a moment that was pretty contentious in the US, and thinking about what it means to emerge after a 17-year cycle into a new kind of world that's unknown. I've been thinking about this poem a lot by Jack Underwood that is really about this kind of idea of time. And I'll just read the end of it. But it's talking about like what it means to have a change in like your usual sleeping position, and what it means to have like kind of the earth change around you. But I think the end is the most important part to me, which says deep time, lovely time, the human print will not survive. I mean, like, woo, there it was. And I think about this process of like these things kind of hatching, experiencing something, and then kind of repeating that cycle over and over again. So the cicada really became a symbol for me of the pandemic. I'm originally from Ohio. This is an insect that we have that kind of signals the start of summer and also the beginning of winter. It's an insect that you hear kind of buzzing throughout the summer, especially in the evening. As it emerges out of underground, it leaves this shell behind, and then it becomes the insect that we know that kind of flies around and buzzes. I was thinking about this like as like this ghostly body or this shell that it kind of leaves behind, its exoskeleton. This was also like a technical project for me as well. The 3D world in the computer doesn't necessarily want to scan or copy something as fragile and as complicated as an exoskeleton. This is a really like complex object to scan inside and also out. And it became kind of an obsession for me to find ways to make the computer and the printer do things that it wasn't necessarily made for or wants to do. Organic forms are a little bit more complicated to replicate depending on the scale and a lot of like material things. I started using this though as a kind of sculptural like symbol in my work for the last couple of years. This is still a pretty open-ended project, but showing you all a little bit of process in my studio, I think especially for scale, is really important to me. It started as the tiny cicada that you just saw, and kind of the goal was to get it into a space that was more my body size. This was a moment when I was having to work inside my studio in complete isolation. I very rarely have the human figure in my work. One thing that you'll see is my hand as kind of a repeating symbol in my work. But other than that, like the human body is relatively absent because the insect body is often the stand-in for it. But in this case, I was thinking about how the cicada kind of emerges out of his shell. If you're not a bug person, these pictures in the top right may not be your favorite. But I think about like how they were emerging often, and also thinking about myself and everyone around me kind of emerging into something new. And this kind of like new world that we're in, a very like stormy and turbulent season, I feel like, in the way that we kind of relate to one another. So I started using myself and 3D scanning myself with my cell phone inside of my studio and thinking about ways I could make myself hatch out of the back of this cicada. So the work starts to look and operate as installation, as sculpture. These are all shots from my studio, not fully to scale, but thinking about ways that they start to feel more human size instead of something that we only think about as something only about 2 inches big. At the time, I also was living in New Orleans. We had just experienced Hurricane Ida. And so I was thinking about this kind of also returning home after a month of not being able to be there, and like what the landscape and the environment looked like. So all of this is 3D printed in the same kind of parts that you just saw in the previous kind of image. But the branches that I would normally find a lot of these cicadas, these are all from debris from Hurricane Ida. Color is a really important part of my process and my practice. You'll notice that things are relatively kind of color blocked, or each work has like a color palette to it. In this case, I was working with like kind of a purple, blue, lavender color for a couple of reasons. I think I'm interested in this as a metaphor for thinking about what it means to emerge into a new world. But I also was thinking about this idea of different insects that we think of as kind of resurrection, or insects that are kind of born, or things that we think of as emerging. And so the color like lavender or purple is something that's used kind of cross-culturally as this kind of signifier often of like resurrection or emergence. All of these, though, are made with the intention, and this is the part that's kind of unfinished, so that they glow in the dark. I'm interested in kind of revisiting that space of the black light. These are insects that come out in the evening, they hum and buzz, and then we kind of hear that die down until the next day. So I'm interested in like the sculptures also being able to have this kind of transitional moment in the same way that the environment that they come from goes through a transitional moment every single day. Got a lot of inspiration though from the pandemic, and in terms of like what I was doing with my time. I think during that time we were all going on a lot of walks. And so I found myself visiting a site in New Orleans called City Park. And it led me to create this piece called Suspended. And I think this, more than anything in my practice, is one of the more transitional and maybe important pieces that I've made in the last few years. It's based on and utilizes pieces from what's speculated to be the oldest live oak tree in the city of New Orleans. It's called the McDonough oak. It's existed for over 800 years. Its trunk spans around 25 feet in diameter, and it's easily kind of identified by locals and visitors by these telephone poles that they've implemented to help hold up its branches. Something to know about this particular site is that it used to be part of a plantation that was established in the 1770s. And the tree sits on an area that then was later purchased by a man named John McDonough, who donated the land to the city upon his death in around like 1850. The tree was named after him, and it still retains his name as its kind of placard, even though the tree existed long before his proprietorship and will exist and still does long after. I find it to be a complicated piece of nature because it holds on to the name of someone who was a slaveholder that was using this land in ways that were, especially in New Orleans, talking about how to appropriately identify and talk through and understand history of sites. So New Orleans, like a lot of cities, is going through the process of kind of reconsidering things like street names, park names, all of these different kind of spaces and places. And what was interesting to me, though, is that this piece of nature, at least at the moment, falls out of something deemed important enough for that name change to be something that, I think we personally should reconsider. What you're looking at right now is actually my 3D scanner. This is a little bit different. Rather than using my cell phone, I do take some specimens back to my studio and 3D scan them. This is a 3D scanning process of a piece of the McDonough oak. I visited this tree every single day by walking and would collect one thing that it had dropped. And so I was thinking about kind of this reconstruction of the tree, or kind of memorializing the tree in a different sort of way. And certainly thinking about that aspect of fossilizing something that I had talked about from the beginning. The tree itself has this colonnade of telephone poles that surround it. So it actually looks like a big 3D print in space. When we 3D print things, and in this image, you can see there are these things underneath that are called supports. That allows the printer to reproduce the object you're asking it to make. It captures things, or it helps build up things, or give material support for things that are organic or that maybe don't have a flat side. So things, especially in my case, organic matter always needs it. So these are just kind of bits and parts of what it looks like when I spend a day, what I think of as my studio outside. These are kind of things that I would collect from the tree over time. I collected and went to this tree over 100 times. These are what the prints look like when they come off of my 3D printer. Sometimes, in some cases, the 3D print isn't the end of my process. In this case, it is. Sometimes I'll take things off of the 3D printer and I'll make molds, or I'll cast them in other materials. In this case, the 3D print is the actual object, and it is the actual material in the end. When a 3D object is like printed, it's surrounded, like I said, by these kind of complex support systems. And I'm really interested in how working this way kind of interrogates this computerized attempt at replicating this historic piece of nature. Each one of these copies is then later kind of precariously and intentionally suspended on top of a really like beautifully fabricated piece of oak that mimics the block that's underneath the tree, on top of a piece of brass that mimics the telephone pole that happens on site. And so I'm interested in this kind of human mediation that's happened on site, this husbandry with the tree, and my kind of like husbandry to a certain extent with this machine in my studio, and trying to replicate the same kind of relationship. And at the same time, fossilize this 800-year-old part of our natural environment that unfortunately I don't think long-term will probably survive climate change in this area. When I'm working in my studio, I'll often kind of capture things in different formats. I was thinking a lot about like kind of how the climate is rapidly changing. I live half of the year in New Orleans, in a place that's below sea level, certainly in a place that's vulnerable. And I think about that idea of fossilizing nature a lot, especially nature that has a complex past and a historical kind of linked site to it. It's like a imperfect attempt for both the artist and the computer to reproduce natural ephemera through a digital fabrication process. And it kind of points to our desire as humans to suspend our impact on what can only exist during our kind of brief moment here, and think about the realities of that as we kind of confront the past and also address the present, especially in a historical sense and in a present sense of like how we interact with each other. What you're looking at are flatbed scans of each object that I also 3D scan. So these are, we can think about these as like flat photographs. And I did that because in installation sense, you're looking at an aerial view of the installation of this piece that was at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans. This is in their kind of central gallery. It has a walkway that allows you to kind of walk up a rotunda and view the installation from different spaces. I was thinking about this as that same round platform that my 3D printer also uses to kind of scan something. So thinking about positioning the viewer at the center of this particular installation as if they were the object being 3D scanned. There's a light that goes around the installation that's meant to kind of simulate that light that you saw in the previous image, in the previous video, that it uses to kind of shine light on the object as the scanner is photographing it to make it into a three-dimensional object. What you can't see very well in these images, because it's intentionally dark, are those two-dimensional images that also surround the entire installation. And the reason those are there is that when we 3D scan something in this particular way, it's a series of still images that are stitched together in a circular kind of format to remake the object that's at the center. In terms of reconstructing the tree in real space, the base of it is so wide in real life that you can't actually fit even the outline of it inside of this gallery. This is about a 15-foot platform, so it's a scaled down exact outline of the base of this particular tree. And then this is where I was mentioning that the oak blocks and the brass stands become a part of the installation that kind of simulates what the tree looks like in real space. This is just a close-up of different specimens that I had collected from this tree in New Orleans. And I think it's important to know that I'm really interested in working all the way from the floor, all the way to the ceiling in a lot of my installations. And I was fortunate that in this one, I was able to access the kind of ceiling. So there are also branches that are suspended from the top. Something you don't see very well in this image, but there are small cicadas that are also embedded as a part of these images as well, and as a part of these 3D scans that have then been replicated back out as full-size branches. And inside of this space, when you view this space, you're confronted with the sound of cicadas buzzing and humming the entire time you're visiting the installation, because they live on that tree and underneath that tree. So it's kind of a convergence of this previous project of thinking through the cicada as a metaphor for kind of re-entering the world. And then this piece kind of becomes a transitional piece for me as something that allows us to kind of explore site history, but using digital fabrication as a process, as a sculptural process and tool to think through kind of the complications of different sites that we use now. I like to show some up-close images of some of these 3D prints just because these are really complicated for a computer to remake. They're very thin. It's like the antithesis of what the machine actually wants to make. I think it's important to kind of highlight the aspects of kind of pushing the machine to produce parts of our environment that it was never meant to necessarily reproduce, but asking it to do that for me anyway, and thinking about how this might be the only way in the future I might be able to hold on to a piece of this nature or a piece of this site. I've been thinking about this idea of borders for a while. This was a piece I made in, I believe, 2017 called Primitive Borders. And what you're looking at is a really large ant farm, essentially. It was a speculative installation where ants act as metaphors for human societies and human people. It was inspired by the Uncle Milton ant farm. Those have been being sold commercially, I want to say, for around 60 years. In this case, the ants could freely travel from what I consider to be kind of individual continents. I made this during a time when the United States had unfortunately put sanctions in place that didn't allow certain people from certain countries to come or cross into our borders. This piece was shown at Transmedial in Berlin, and it was during that particular time. I thought about each one of these kind of existing as a continent, if you would, or like a country. And each one is kind of linked together using this complex system of tubes. I think about these as highways or kind of travel pathways that allow the ants in the installation to travel from one continent, if we think about it like that, to another. It uses what we think of as kind of futuristic materials. This is called ant gel. Actually, when you buy an ant farm, most of the time now you get one that looks like this. From what I can tell in my research, and maybe somebody can correct me, but from what I can tell, they developed this material for doing scientific studies for anti-gravity, for sending ants into outer space. For example, it's a material unlike sand that can't break apart. It's both a material that the ants live in and they also eat it, and provides like a moisture source for them. Part of like where the name of the piece comes from, primitive, is this idea of primitive shapes that exist in 3D modeling software. So when we get a 3D modeling software, it always comes with basic building blocks: a sphere, a cube, some kind of like cylinder or a triangle or something that we can use to start building an object in 3D space. So all of these different continents are made using different primitives kind of fitted together and then kind of replicate this like ant farm shape as we think of it. I think it's important to share with you like what fabrication looks like on my end as an artist. So I make all of these models in the computer. I then use the CNC machine that I talked about before to carve out each half of what I needed to make these ant farms. And then I vacuum formed plastic over top of it to create the kind of positives that would make up each side of the ant farm. So a lot of my studio practice, as much as I joke that I dislike math, involves a lot of math and a lot of measurements. And I'm really interested in kind of fabricating these installations from from the bottom all the way up down to even the connector parts, if it's possible. I'm going to switch to some pieces that are a little bit older, but I feel are really important to where my work is now. And by older, I mean these are from anywhere between 2014 and 2017. I took a really transformative trip and residency to the Arctic Circle. I was really struck by how rapidly the environment was changing around me. It was the first time that I had really traveled somewhere for my work that made me feel an urgent sense of how quickly the environment is changing around us. This is a picture from the middle of June. May not look like it, but this is off the coast of Svalbard, which is in the Arctic Circle, north of Norway. And I would say that this residency and this whole experience really like changed my life and my practice. You go on a residency with artists, scientists, performers on a barkentine sailing ship like you see here, and sail around the Arctic. You sail around Svalbard or Spitsbergen for around 2 weeks. It was interesting because I had a whole plan for my work in this area. And I realized when I got there that the environment I wasn't thinking about the environment in combination with my tools. Things like batteries freezing, things like not being able to leave a camera somewhere or not being able to traverse a certain landscape. Just to give you an idea of scale, I think, unless you've been there, you've been in a place of this scale, that's all of us on the far left. We would get off the boat and go onto the land to kind of do work every single day. But I think I wasn't prepared for how kind of monumentous in scale this particular space was. What was really striking to me, though, was how quickly the ice was shifting, changing, and melting in this particular region, and also the colors. This is an unedited picture of what colors look like in this space, often confronted with a lot of gray, and then these really special moments of very bright and intense colors from the water or from the ice or from glaciers. What you're looking at is a piece of glacial ice that's broken off of a glacial front. This would happen so often that we actually couldn't take the ship within a certain distance of glaciers in case they broke. It was interesting to me because I didn't think about the Arctic, for example, having things like beaches or having ice that could wash up on shore. And so I got really struck by a couple of things. As cold as this environment looks in a picture, it actually was way above kind of average temperatures. There were days that we had on a long sleeve t-shirt in this environment, not normal. And so I got really enamored. I would say this is where the idea of kind of fossilization really started in my work. I got really enamored with the pieces of glacial ice that would break off. And so I started working on this series called Roughly 9 Translations. So the project that I had planned to work on couldn't happen because I didn't bring the right type of batteries. So I really was left in the Arctic with an iPhone 4 and a DSLR camera and myself, and having to really think about what was important to me to kind of capture and communicate from this landscape. So Roughly 9 Translations became a series of 3D scans that I had made of glacial ice with my cell phone. And the ice was photographed that had washed up onto the shoreline of different kind of outings or excursions that I showed you an image of. What was so interesting about this to me is these are elements or materials from the landscape that really had a finite life of existing within that particular shape or that particular form. And I was really interested in kind of capturing that. So this project references issues of global warming, the translation of material states from solid to liquid to image to point cloud to dimensional slices and then back out. And then also thinking materially about what's a detriment to the landscape. So what you're looking at is a 3D scan of Arctic sea ice that's then been put back in the computer. It's obviously lost data in that process of going from the environment to my computer. The 3D scanner is not perfect. It can't capture everything in the context of photogrammetry using my phone, which is how I was doing it. And then I was basically turning these into puzzle piece slices that were laser cut out of different types of acrylic that reference the colors in the Arctic landscape. So these ultimately are made out of a plastic, which is the same material that we were often finding. We'd find bags worth of plastic every day washed ashore as far as the Arctic Circle. From all over the world, which was pretty wild. But these were photographed to really be able to be reproduced as almost this skeletal version of what they once were, and really intentionally kind of skeletal. They're all made out of different types of laser cut acrylic, but all start from a 3D kind of model. And so to give you an idea of what that process looks like, I would walk around circles of little pieces of glacial ice that had washed on shore, would 3D scan them with my phone. So that's what you're looking at in the bottom left is the actual 3D scan. I would often get rid of the actual ground plane where I would be walking and then would isolate it into its own kind of object. And then I would run it through another software. All of these are free softwares, by the way. I'm really interested in kind of the openness of all of these platforms, but I would run this back into a free software at the time that would essentially turn it into flat planes that I could build it back together in a puzzle. And so I made a pretty big series of these for a way to think through that landscape and also think about fossilizing that landscape in materials that I think will be the material marker of our time on Earth, unfortunately, which is plastic. I worked through the Arctic Circle material for quite a while. It's also a very fossil rich area. And so I was really interested in kind of the types of fossils we would see and we would find in this space. It was an interesting kind of moment. It's a landscape that you don't want to disturb. And so I had started 3D scanning this particular fossil that I ended up taking out of the landscape, and I felt really guilty for taking it. It looked like a rock from the beach. I later learned that it was like a fossil. It is a tooth. I think it's a tooth fossil from talking to a couple of geologists. And I felt so guilty about removing this dime-sized piece of material from this landscape. I felt like I needed to memorialize my guilt. So I made this thing called fossilized guilt, which is a copy or replica of my hand that I took the fossil with. And you'll also see the color orange being used a lot in this particular series of installations because I had been wearing a pair of orange pants. I thought I would be found if I got lost in the snow, if I wore these orange pants every day. And they became my kind of like collection device when I was in the Arctic. Thought about the tape because we would often be set up to work in very specific perimeters in this landscape. There are polar bears. We had polar bear guards. So we would often have to work within a very specific perimeter. And so I thought about that a lot in terms of like what it looked like to do an installation of this piece. This idea of insects kind of constantly acting as both a metaphorical kind of operator in my work as humans, but also thinking about the ways that we might reframe the idea of pest has been something that's been really important in my work. Early on, I had made a series called Partner, We Are All Pests, which was a 9 by 9 foot intentionally pine meeting table, we could call it this. It's a very early piece from 2011 that housed a series of termites that I was feeding my paper waste. I had read an article from the EPA that termites, when they eat a piece of computer paper, can produce hydrogen gas. And I got really interested in this idea of termites being this potential partner rather than a pest in like energy production. I'm not a chemist, I'm not a scientist, but I do have this fantasy of thinking through like all of the detrimental things that pests do and thinking about ways of reframing them to kind of change the way we have this kind of almost like cradle to cradle relationship with one another. Inside of this table were a series of termites that were being fed little sculptures that I had made out of my paper waste. The image on the left is a pulp-based sculpture that was made out of all of my bills. On the right-hand side, you're looking at like a shredded up pizza box. I was basically shredding up and repulping all of these different things that were made out of paper because termites, because paper is a derivative of trees, they will eat that material. And so I became really interested in thinking about how much hydrogen gas a termite might be able to produce from my own paper waste. I'm really interested in this kind of these different levels of like decay and shift and change. And so this was kind of like an early experiment. The table itself, the reason people would walk on it or sit on it, or I found people having like lunch in the galleries during their kind of breaks, is that it was a sonic table. So while you were sitting on it, you were listening to the termites eat the paper waste in real time. So it used sound transduction speakers that turned the surface of the wood into the actual speaker itself. I really wanted people to kind of have to level their bodies down into this almost pest-like kind of lower to the ground way of experiencing, looking in onto this process as we might kind of sit together on the same like level. I have really shifted gears in the last like 2 years to kind of work on a place called Tawawa Chimney Corner House that I'm working on with my family. This is a historic site located in Wilberforce, Ohio. My great-great-grandparents used to live in this house. They were civil rights activists who were founding members of the Niagara Movement, which is the forerunner to the NAACP. And I've been thinking through 3D scanning and sight as a way to kind of reconstruct different historical kind of narratives from this particular site and be able to take them other places beyond just like the site itself, so that elements of the site aren't tied to it in the same way that I was doing that with a lot of other pieces in the Arctic or with Suspended. I'm kind of constantly like grabbing things from the environment and shifting where we view them. Right now, I'm working through a lot of like historical images and documents. What's been really fascinating to me to find out is, like, for example, this image was taken on the right in Allegheny, PA, which turns out is modern day Pittsburgh. And I drive across this intersection pretty much every single day that I come to work, and had no idea that they even lived here for a period of time. Same with Chicago. I'm now working on a series that's about their life and time in Chicago for a show in 2025. But I'm for the first time working with historical, flat, non-three-dimensional images in space and trying to think about how to use computation and digital fabrication as a way to tell historical kind of narratives. I've been doing things like reconstructing the archway, for example, that you just saw. We're in a moment where we're reconsidering things like monuments in the United States. I think about groups like Monument Lab, who are like challenging what monuments look like and how they exist in this country. And I've been using the language of monuments, plaques, arches, pillars, reconstructions of architectural models as ways to link sites together. So in this particular work, was linking Harper's Ferry, which is where John Brown, one of the original kind of anti-slavery abolitionists, led an original crusade, and also linking parts of Tawawa Chimney Corner House. My great-great-grandparents were like regular orators and would give a lot of speeches, and one of which was called The Spirit of John Brown, which is like thinking about how John Brown kind of crusaded for something and what that meant. And so I've been kind of using this language of monuments to tie these histories together. This is made out of that same recycled foam, the same CNC process that you saw for the logs earlier on. And this is reconstructed from two things: the photograph that I showed you of the original site, but also the pillars as they exist now. So this is a reconstruction from an image from the 1800s, an actual physical scan of what exists in the pillar site now. I'm working with a lot of things like wallpaper and historical images for the first time. I'm also working with this thing called a multigraph, which was an image trick where a sitter would sit in between two mirrors and it would replicate themselves as if they were having a 5-way conversation with themselves. It was a photo trick that was used in the kind of like early 1900s. You'd see it a lot at World's Fairs. And I'm starting to use mirror and glass a lot in my work as a reflective mechanism for quite literally, like, for example, two-way glass, or like security glass, like being able to see half of a model and literally see another half of a different model on the other side and layer it together. So like what you're looking at right now is a reconstruction, a laser cut reconstruction of John Brown's site, using two-way glass so that it could also layer on top of a model of Tawawa Chimney Corner House. So quite literally using the material as a way to layer the sites on top of one another. I'm using text for the very first time. I'm not a person that works in text on objects often, but I'm starting to use some of the text from the speeches that were more significant as elements that are a part of the work. And so a lot of these exist. You'll see the repetition of my hand again. I use that as kind of this generational link between my body and the two bodies of people that are linked to me, but that I didn't get the chance to meet. And I've been kind of using my hand as this kind of generational reach within the actual work itself. These are all 3D printed plaques, and then the hands are cast from molds that I make in my studio. And then this is an example of that multigraph in the bottom left, and an image from Harper's Ferry. I use the mirror because the mirroring and the glass mirror is such a central part of this particular exhibition. Also in the images that made up the wallpaper, The wallpaper came both from the house and also from this image. They also use a mirroring technique on purpose to kind of reference that material relationship between the glass and the actual images, and how all of these things that we're talking about in terms of civil rights and activism, the biggest impetus for it is that the mirrored glass becomes a way to think about how all of these issues are cyclical. In a sad sense to me, these issues are still prevalent and haven't changed. While we've certainly made some advances, the glass to me acts as this thing to both look through something but also reflect it back to you. And so that's become a really important material for me in this particular body of work. But this looks very different. You'll see like the color red is used in this installation quite a bit. For me, the red actually comes from a book cover called The Pilgrimage of Harriet Ransom's Son, which is the autobiography of my great-great-grandfather. And so that red color comes from the text that you're kind of looking at in here. So the color is very intentional. This is an image from the mirror inside of Tawawa Chimney Corner House right now. As I'm kind of working on this series, and I think about things like this glass and things like the mirror inside of the home, I've been thinking a lot about how I'm interested in this reflective version of history, but also how that's like reflective of this time now, and taking images and materials from sites and kind of reconstructing them has always been at the core part of my practice. But that now I'm doing that from a very personal and kind of family historical space rather than just from a kind of shared open environment space. But I'm looking for ways that those kind of two spaces converge in my work. And I feel like this has kind of become a like full circle kind of moment of returning both back to a site, also my home state, and also thinking through things like the environment that surround this house as kind of markers for how I might talk about the narrative and the history and importance of this kind of in a broader context. Thanks so much for joining my Geeks Talk lecture. Thanks so much for spending some time listening to me and with me. I'm looking forward to discussing your questions with Kimberly Thomas at the Geeks Talk Q&A podcast coming up this spring.
Thanks for joining. This season, Geeks Talks will present 4 featured speakers and 2 paired Q&A discussions on the Geeks Talks Q&A podcast. Following their respective Geeks Talks lectures, stay tuned for the upcoming podcast episode featuring Britt Ransom and Kimberly Thomas around May 2024. Your questions will shape the conversation. Email questions for Britt Ransom to questions@geeks.glass by Friday, March 22nd. Geeks programming relies on subscriptions, partnerships, and sponsorships. Speaker honorariums are generated from a communal pool of institutional subscribers. Individual subscriptions provide support for all of Geeks programming. Subscribe to gain access to the full Geeks Talks archive of lectures and Q&As featuring contemporary artists and researchers working with glass. Want to learn more? Visit geeks.glass/support. Many thanks to our subscribers for your continued support. With the Geeks Talks model, we hope to reinvest in artists and researchers and set a precedent for shared artists' talks in the collective field of glass. Thanks as well to our organizational partners. Organizational partnerships are intended for craft schools, glass schools, museums, cultural institutions, art service organizations, and truly all organizations interested in education both in and beyond the field of glass. This video has been sponsored by Wet Dog Glass. In business since 1996, Wet Dog Glass delivers unsurpassed value and turnkey hot glass studio equipment, studio planning and consultation, and technical support. Wet Dog Glass, your studio's best friend. Visit their website at wdg-us.com. Many thanks to Britt Ransom, and of course thanks to you for listening, sharing, and supporting Geeks Talks. Stay tuned.